Welcome to the Mac's Future Weekly Podcast. All Apple talk and no chit chat.
Okay, welcome to the Apple Podcast episode 115. This is Lex at maxfuture.com. Hey, today is Saturday, May 19th, 2012, and this is the Apple Podcast by Lex. And this is episode 115. And you can support this podcast by going into iTunes and giving it any sort of positive review. That would be well appreciated. And also get other people interested in the podcast. And of course, you can go to YouTube, and there's the video version of this podcast, which has screenshots of the different stories, apps, and devices I talk about. And it's under the Mac's Future channel, and also Blip TV has the video version under Mac's Future, and also under iTunes there's Apple Things under Mac's Future. So check out any of those. And so there's a lot of Apple news. Let's talk about it. Well, it's been a rocky time in recent days and recent weeks for Apple investors. Disclosure: I am an Apple investor. I own Apple stock. I've been I've owned Apple stock since, at least, I guess, 2001. So I'm one of the lucky people who bought a long time ago. So I'm not really hurt by recent events. But here's the thing. If you're looking at the video version of this, I have a screenshot of Yahoo Finance. Apple stock has come down a lot from its high of $644 per share. As of Friday, yesterday, it was trading around $530. So that's a steep drop, and it doesn't really make sense. I mean, a lot of it is the stock market in general has been sort of, damaged. And, why is Apple stock, I guess, peaking and then going down? If you're looking at Yahoo Finance, maybe I can compare this to let's put Facebook. Let's put Google. So Google, I think, has also been sort of hurting. If you're looking at the graph of this, Google sort of has been going up and down with Apple too. Let's see if we can compare the stock price to the NASDAQ, which is the stock exchange. And if you look at Apple stock, it sort of went up with the NASDAQ and then down. But on the other hand, Apple stock is a big part of the NASDAQ because it's such a massive company and so many people hold it that when Apple goes up, maybe the NASDAQ goes up. So the thing is, though, it's not like Apple missed a quarter or did anything to really warrant the stock price going down. And I was trying to explain to somebody recently, don't look at the price of the per share, because the price per share, what does that mean? That's almost an arbitrary amount because it's a function of how many shares the company issues. So, for example, if the company only issues 10 shares and the company's worth, $100,000, then arguably each share is worth, or should be, trading at about $10,000. However, if the company's worth 100,000 and issues 1,000,000 shares, each share should be trading for less. So one metric that a lot of people look at to see how expensive a stock is something called the price-earnings ratio. And that is the price of the stock divided by the earnings. Now, what does that mean? Well, if you think about it, people who invest in companies like Apple are investing in businesses. I mean, Apple's not a charity. Facebook is not a charity. Google is not a charity. And people like me or you who invest in a stock, we're hoping that company at some point become a profitable business. And so price earnings ratio is a metric that tells you how expensive the stock is. So basically, you take the price of the stock, in this case, Apple stock is at $530 per share, and divide it by the earnings per share. Now, the earnings per share is how much profit that a company makes per share of stock. So think of it this way. each share of stock is a slice of ownership of the company. So if the company could take all the profits it made in 1 year and distribute those profits to each person who owns a share, a slice of the company, that's what the earnings or the profit per share would be for each share. And Apple, so the idea being the more profitable a company is, the lower that PE ratio is going to be, right? So if a company has lots of profit and its stock price isn't very high per share, then that ratio is going to be low, right? But if you have very little profit and your price is very high, then the PE ratio number is going to be high. And Apple's PE ratio, relative to a lot of tech companies, is pretty low. It's only $12.92. So that's pretty low. And, you know, Apple is projected to continue to grow and get even more profits in the coming quarter. So why, is it down from 644 to 530? And I think there's just general fear in the stock market, and the stock market as a whole. And Apple's such a big company, that's what's happening. Now, to give you a sense of how Apple's PE ratio compares to other companies, let's look at Google. Google's PE ratio is higher than Apple's. It's $18.20, but it's not crazy high. Facebook, which just recently went public on Friday, what's its PE ratio? Well, Facebook's PE ratio is a whopping 88.3. That means its ratio of profit to earnings is much higher than Apple's. And so, what would be the theory as to why, a stock price or a stock would have a PE ratio so high? Well, one belief is that investors think that Facebook is going to really grow its profits, so that as it'll in the future that it's going to make a lot more profits than it's making now. Now let's compare that to Amazon. Amazon's stock has a PE ratio of 176.59. So Amazon stock price as a ratio of the stock price to its profits per share is extremely high. It's more than 10 times the ratio of Apple's price per share. So, I'm scratching my head. I don't really understand why Apple stock is at such a low price per share. Look, for Apple stock to have the price per earnings ratio of Amazon, it's something like 15 times. It would have to trade at a 15-time higher price. It would mean that Apple would have to trade at a stock price of like $7,000 per share to have the same PE ratio as Amazon. So, some would say that Apple stock is undervalued at this time. And but everybody has to be very careful when they invest, because the stock market can easily go up, can easily go down, and stocks can easily go up and down. So anyways, it's something that has puzzled me. Okay, so one of the things that kind of stunned me today, and is kind of a sad event in the Apple community, is that it appears that the famous Apple blogger and podcaster John Gruber has left the 5x5 network, where he had a podcast show with Dan Benjamin, I guess the founder of 5x5 Network, and with really no announcement, without any announcement by either Dan Benjamin 5x5 on one hand or Mr. Gruber. Mr. Gruber has left, and he's now doing the talk show podcast under the same name that he used for the podcast when he was with Dan Benjamin, on another podcast network called Mule Radio Syndicate. And I learned about this today from the Apple columnist and blogger and journalist Philip Elmer DeWitt over on CNNmoney.com, Apple 2.0. And he's kind of surprised too. He has a very good point. He says that John Gruber leaving is the equivalent in podcasting news of Conan O'Brien leaving NBC for TBS, Turner Broadcasting Systems. So I'm kind of stunned. I obviously podcast myself, the Apple podcast and the iPad podcast, and I've been a fan of John Gruber's and Dan Benjamin. I've long been a listener of Leo Laporte over at the Twit network, and he sort of got me interested in podcasting. I would listen to This Week in Tech on Twit network and Mac Break Weekly, and then I started reading John Gruber's Daring Fireball website, where he has interesting articles and tidbits and links, and then I found Dan Benjamin to be very refreshing. I like his upbeat hosting ability, and I like the combination of John Gruber and Daring Fireball on one hand, teaming up with John Gruber teaming up with Dan Benjamin. I felt like they were like best friends. So it's kind of stunning that they, without announcing anything, suddenly John Gruber's talk show, which I think was co-hosted with Dan Benjamin, is now with Dan Benjamin on a different network called Mule Radio Syndicate. So it's unclear what happened. Philip Elmer DeWitt basically cites something that's on another blog by someone named Jonathan Poritsky, who speculates that there may have been a falling out over the rights to pre-WWDC batch of talk show T-shirts that 5x5 was putting out, or a dispute over the division of proceeds from 5x5's new iPhone app, which costs like, I guess, $2.99 or something like that in the Apple Store, in the App Store. Or it says a disagreement over who owes whom more for the other's fame and prominence. Or maybe they got tired of each other. But it's just, I don't know. I think it's a little strange that neither of them has made an announcement. I think it would be nice if they did. I'm a listener of theirs, and I think it would be nice to know what transpired. But look, I'll tell you, I've been podcasting now. This is my 115th episode of the Apple Podcast, and I went for a format that's very different, I think, than a lot of people, because you listen to Mac Break Weekly and you've got like 3 or 4 guests talking, or you might have a 2-person podcast. But what I like about, my podcast being just me talking is, frankly, I feel like I'm talking to you guys out there, the people who are listening, and I'm having a conversation. And yeah, I could have a partner, I could have guests on, but this is a hobby for me, and this is not my job. I have another job that I don't really discuss here, and I just do this when I have free time. And if I was going to do something where I had a regular co-host or a panel of people, it would become much more like work, and it would be hard for me to maintain, and just during my free time. So, and also I like the freedom of not having to worry if my co-host decides he doesn't like being my co-host and just disappears and goes to another network. So this type of thing that happened here with the talk show can't really happen here with the Apple Podcast, because I can't divorce myself. I mean, the worst that can happen is I just decide at some point not to podcast anymore. So it's kind of sad. I don't know if they'll ever get back together, but there was a lot of chemistry I felt between Dan Benjamin and John Gruber, and I haven't yet listened to, I guess he's already posted a first episode of the talk show on on the Mule Radio Syndicate, and I haven't listened to it yet. And we'll have to see how it goes. But I guess, if you recall, actually, one of the reasons that I got into podcasting was I got a little annoyed with Jason Calacanis when he was on the Twit show, and I thought, why don't I put out my own views in a podcast? And if you remember Jason Calacanis, who's got This Weekend podcast, he was like an active member of the Twit podcast that comes out on Sundays on Leo Laporte's network. And then he had a huge falling out with Leo Laporte because I guess he went out and started his own rival, podcasting network. And, the name, he used a name that was similar to Twit, This Weekend Technology. He used This Weekend, startups, or This Weekend that. And so I think Leo Laporte felt that he had, wasn't a good friend. So, that kind of, is another reason why I don't, I think, some people would think my podcast more interesting if I had like other person on and debate and that sort of thing. But really, is it necessary? If you ever listen to some of Dan Benjamin's podcasts, like the one with John Siracusa just goes on and on and on talking, and Benjamin hardly says anything. And actually, to some extent, John Gruber on the talk show would do most of the talking and not Dan Benjamin. But I have to say, Dan Benjamin as a host is tremendous because he's got that sort of Larry King quality to him where he can really, direct the guest or the other participant in the talk show to, move on to a new subject. And he's really good at sort of, being a foil for, let's say, John Siracusa or the other podcasts that he has, like with Andy Ihnatko. So, well, it's going to be interesting to see what happens. But this is in the Apple fan community or the Apple, interest community. This is a kind of a big deal that John Gruber has split with Dan Benjamin. So it's sad. Anyways, but life goes on. So there's a interesting story in MacRumors.com. There's a number of movies that are going to be coming out regarding Steve Jobs, and one of the more significant and maybe one of the more interesting ones is a movie that's going to be made where the screenwriter is Aaron Sorkin, who's a famous playwright from Broadway, and then also was the creator or the writer behind The West Wing. And of course, he did the movie, he wrote the screenplay to the Social Network movie. So he's a pretty big deal writer. And apparently he gave an interview, according to MacRumors, to Reuters. And he said he was looking for something in Jobs' life to hang the movie on. And according to the quote from MacRumors, Sorkin noted that, quote, the Social Network, end quote, saw the Facebook story through the lens of an acrimonious lawsuit that pitted CEO Mark Zuckerberg against his Harvard friends and over the creation of Facebook. And Sorkin is quoted as saying, drama is tension versus obstacle. Someone wants something. Something is standing in their way of getting it. They want the money. They want the girl. They want to get to Philadelphia. It doesn't matter. And I need to find that event, and I will. I just don't know what it is, end quote, Sorkin said. He noted that it won't be a straight-ahead biography because a biography has a natural cradle-to-grave structure. So, also it says here that Sorkin has hired Steve Wozniak, who co-founded Apple, to be a consultant on the movie by Sony Pictures. So it's an interesting question. What would be the hook in drama that Aaron Sorkin could draw upon for Steve Jobs in making a movie on his life? Well, clearly, in a way, there was drama in all of Steve Jobs' life. I think, though, one driving thing to the tension was Steve Jobs' competitiveness for his vision. And his vision, and really it's a beautiful story of success, loss, redemption, ultimate redemption, and then tragedy. So Aaron Sorkin, the arc is there because so what is the overall tension? It's really Steve Jobs, drive to be successful, not for the sake of being successful, but for the sake of his vision that he can deliver technology that is useful and works, and that is beautiful and attractive to us. And so really, and if you think about the tension is in his telling the story of a movie of his life. The drama is this, that he shot out of nowhere, right? I mean, he was working with Steve Wozniak. They were in a garage somewhere. Steve Wozniak was making these boards that he was showing to the Homebrew Computer Club. And it wasn't a computer, but Steve Jobs, early on in Apple's life, when the first Apple came out, and then more importantly, the second Apple II, he really saw that he needed to make it a compelling, attractive, useful device to beat its competitors. And Apple had competitors in that initial computer market in 1978, 1977. But his whole thing was aesthetics, bringing beauty and design to an incredibly nerdy, geeky business, which is technology. And so you have the arc there because you have this quest, this guy who, went to Reed College, couldn't afford it, audited the calligraphy classes where he learned about the beauty of fonts and writing and aesthetics, and then who, was somewhat of a hippie, and, when he had little money, he took that money and he went to India and he saw what incredible poverty was, and believed in Eastern religions, and then he comes back and he's a businessman, but he's a businessman with a drive to show people what they want, rather than going out and polling people and saying, what do you want? He had the vision to say, look, I'm going to make a product that people want to see. I mean, in a way, he's like P.T. Barnum, right? I mean, P.T. Barnum didn't go around with his circus and say, hey, what do people want to see in a circus? No. P.T. Barnum went out and got all sorts of crazy acts because he knew he wanted to show people something they've never seen before. And that's what Steve Jobs realized, that he wanted to show people something they've never seen before. And that's what the first Macintosh was, something that people never saw before, and that was just so futuristic and maybe not in execution, but in the concept of it, that people would lust after it. So Steve is really selling the future, innovation, design, aesthetics, bringing that all together. And so what is the conflict? The conflict is he has all this success, and then he's thrown out of his company. He's essentially pushed out of it. He feels like a failure. And then who wins? Who wins is Bill Gates and Microsoft and Windows and maybe even IBM. Companies that don't have that sense of aesthetic, that sense of perfection and beauty, and really pushing the envelope in terms of innovation. I mean, look at Microsoft. Microsoft doesn't really push the envelope. It's so happy and so content to dominate the enterprise and business with its backward compatible Windows operating system, that it's afraid to innovate because innovation is a challenge to its monopoly in the enterprise area. So anyways, the arc of the story that Sorkin should see is that, okay, this guy's thrown out. It looks like his rival, his age, Bill Gates was born the same year. They were starting off together, and then they became rivals, and Bill Gates became huge, and Steve was sort of left out in the cold, and yet he makes this incredible comeback, changes computing completely again by coming to Apple, pioneering the iPod, pioneering the iPhone, and then tragically, because of his own sense of of himself, that he could overcome anything, he maybe didn't pay attention to his cancer, and then when he did, it was too late, and it spread, and he tragically dies at the height of this incredible redemption, incredible success. So I don't know, Sorkin. That's one way to look at the drama. So anyways, I'm looking forward to that movie. Okay, so Apple's battles with the Android world continue, and it's really heating up. There's a story out from PCWorld which points out that Apple files for a preliminary injunction against the Galaxy Tab 10.1. And, there's, as the article points out, this is the latest move in a complex series of patent-related cases between Apple, Samsung, and other Android makers. So basically, Apple filed an emergency action in the United States District Court yesterday, late Friday, to ban Samsung's Galaxy 10.1 tab in the United States. And this comes after an appeals court ruling earlier in the week that sided with Apple on the validity of an iPad design patent. So basically, the higher court basically said Apple's patent was viable. But the weird thing is, as the article points out, as part of its litigation with Samsung, Apple is going to court-mandated settlement negotiations starting May 21st and May 22nd. So it says that the injunction is not likely to be granted over the next few days. Well, I'm not so sure that's true. It goes on to say the motion for preliminary injunction was filed in the Northern District of California, where Judge Lucy Koh is presiding over several cases. So, this is sort of a high-stakes game between Apple, Samsung, and other Android makers like HTC. And the question is, what will it take for Apple and these companies to settle their disputes? I think what Apple is looking for is a commitment from Samsung in particular to make its devices look and feel significantly different than the iPad or the iPhone. I think that's Apple's main gripe. Now, here's the interesting thing. There's this ongoing Google-Oracle lawsuit where Oracle, which acquired Sun, is claiming that Google ripped off Sun's patents or copyrights on the Java software. And in that trial, the original Android phone that Google was working on came out, and it looked very different than the iPhone. In fact, it looked more like a BlackBerry, a keyboard, hardware keyboard device, with some limited software. So, Apple has an interest in arguing that Android really ripped off the look and feel of the iPhone. Now, I have my own pet theory as to why, or maybe what might be one of the motives that Larry Ellison had in his Oracle lawsuit against Google. And here, I'm going to tell you it. So, as you may know, Oracle, which is a major public company and software company that makes, I guess, enterprise-based database software for enterprise, has been in a very nasty lawsuit with Google that's at trial in Northern California. And basically what went on is that Oracle acquired Sun, which was a huge technology company. And I guess they acquired them maybe in 2010 or 2009. And Sun developed the Java software and operating system, which is, created once and it runs on many platforms. And basically, Oracle sued Google, claiming that Google, when it created Android and released it, it took Java, or took some parts of Java and altered it and didn't license it from Sun or its successor, Oracle. And Google is saying, well, Java was supposed to be open source, and Sun and Oracle is saying, well, it can be open source, but you got to license it and you can't alter it, and that Android alters Java so that Java is not, Android is a different version than Java. It's not compatible with Java. It's forked. So anyway, so Oracle, this big company, suing another big company, Google. And I'm not sure what the damages are going to be or how big it is. But ever since I've been, I've read a number of bios on Steve Jobs, including Walter Isaacson's. And I do think Oracle has legitimate business reasons for suing Google. Completely legitimate. But I also think it's very possible that Larry Ellison has, personal reasons why he enjoys suing Google over Android. And the personal reasons, I would say, are because Steve Jobs was Larry Ellison's one of his closest friends. If you read these biographies of Steve Jobs, you would know that in the 90s, when Steve Jobs, I guess, was not that different in age than Larry Ellison. Larry Ellison's, a billionaire many times over, and him and Steve, I guess, became friends at a very young age when both of them were successful tech executives. And in some ways, I think when they were younger, Steve Jobs was clearly the more successful one, because at a very young age, he had started Apple, and Oracle was still growing. But the thing is, at some point, Oracle became very big in the 90s, and Larry Ellison became very wealthy, and he stayed friends with Steve Jobs, and they were very close. And in the biography, Walter Isaacson talks about at some point when Steve Jobs wasn't working at Apple, Larry Ellison suggested that Larry Ellison fund a takeover of Apple and install Steve Jobs, and Steve Jobs demurred, and in the end, he didn't need Larry Ellison's help to get back at Apple. Apple needed Steve Jobs' next company and brought him back as, interim CEO or whatever. And Steve Jobs, once he was back at Apple in the late 90s, he pretty much took back the company and became the CEO. And he installed Larry Ellison on the board of Apple. And so my theory is that, well, and here's the other thing we know. Steve Jobs was felt incredibly betrayed by Google executives like Eric Schmidt, who sat on the board of Apple and who was the CEO of Google, because they were allies. Google was an ally of Apple in the big battle against Microsoft. And then when the iPhone came out, short time later, Apple and Steve Jobs came to the rude realization that Google was going to compete with the iPhone by releasing this free Android operating system that would allow smartphone manufacturers like HTC and Samsung to undercut the price and compete with a lookalike to the iPhone. And we know that Steve Jobs was incredibly pained by this. I mean, there's a really damaging or harsh statement that Steve Jobs made that's in his bio. Specifically, Steve Jobs told Walter Isaacson that he told Eric Schmidt when he met with him regarding the Android, quote, "I will spend my last dying breath if I need to, and I will spend every penny of Apple's then $40 billion in the bank to right this wrong," he told Isaacson. He said, quote, "I'm going to destroy Android because it's a stolen product. I'm willing to go thermonuclear war on this." And then it says in the book there was Steve Jobs had a meeting with Schmidt to try to see if they could resolve the differences between Google and Apple. And this was they were spotted at a cafe in Palo Alto. And Steve Jobs told Schmidt, quote, "I don't want your money. If you offer me $5 billion, I won't want it. I've got plenty of money. I want you to stop using our ideas in Android. That's all I want," end quote. The meeting, Isaacson wrote, resolved nothing. So it's in that context that you have to think, in Steve Jobs' final years, he was really, really, really pissed off about what Google had done with Android, right? He was so pissed off, he referred to it as, "I will spend my last dying breath if I need to resolve the right that is, to right this wrong," and that he's going to go thermonuclear war. Now, all this time, he's still really good friends with Larry Ellison. And in fact, it's clear from the biography that Steve Jobs sort of decided to build a yacht because Larry Ellison famously had, enjoyed this beautiful yacht. And the French designer Philippe Starck is building that yacht. Steve Jobs passed away. So here's a guy who shared a lot with Larry Ellison. They also both were big fans of Japanese culture, Steve Jobs and Larry Ellison. So Larry Ellison is this multi-billionaire who runs Oracle, and Steve Jobs is his friend. And Steve Jobs is tragically dying of cancer in his final years. And you have to imagine that Steve Jobs would have had conversations with Larry Ellison where he was venting. I mean, Steve Jobs seems like somebody who would vent with his buddies as to what he's pissed off about. So I have to imagine that going back to 2008, Larry Ellison was aware of how upsetting it was to his friend Steve Jobs that Google stole, Android or copied the iPhone. I mean, in particular, remember, this is Silicon Valley. Everybody sort of knows each other, right? And in the early days of Google, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, they wanted to hire Steve Jobs to be the president of Google. And, Steve Jobs didn't do that, but Steve Jobs did give them advice and treat them, was very friendly to them. So Steve Jobs, and maybe even Larry Ellison, I mean, to some extent, they probably viewed themselves as sort of elder statesmen or elder, tech success people to Larry Page and Sergey Brin. So it must have been particularly painful for Steve Jobs to have sort of these younger executives who he felt maybe that, were taken under his wing, betray him by directly competing with the iPhone and coming up with Android. So anyways, look, I don't know what's in Larry Ellison's mind, and it's clear that Oracle has a strong business reason for suing Google. But you have to imagine, for Larry Ellison, it's particularly enjoyable winning any lawsuit against Google on the claim that Android ripped off Java because it helps vindicate his friend who died, his view that Android ripped off the iPhone. I mean, there's two different things. One, ripping off the Java, but if these individuals, the people who run Google, are willing to rip off Java, then it's easy to conclude that they wouldn't, stop at ripping off the iPhone or the iPhone patents or the, the look and feel of the iPhone. So, part of me thinks that, hey, Larry Ellison had a strong personal motive as well as a business motive in suing Google. And he's a guy, Larry Ellison, who is very loyal. I mean, it looks that way because remember that Hewlett Packard had that executive who was accused of some sort of misconduct and was, I guess, forced to resign or left Hewlett Packard, which was a competitor of Oracle. And Larry Ellison played tennis with this guy all the time. And he immediately brought Hurd on board to be, I guess, the CEO of Oracle. And he then took pot shots verbally at the Hewlett Packard board. So this is a guy who is very loyal. And you have to imagine Larry Ellison, in his mind, felt very loyal to Steve Jobs. So if Oracle prevails on any of these claims, and it looks like they've already prevailed on some of the patent claims, regardless of the money, I think Larry Ellison is happy for his friend, Steve Jobs. Okay, so Kickstarter is a cool site where people who want to raise money for a project, whether it's to sell devices or make products that haven't been built yet, or to make a movie or something, can ask people to donate, and then some people can get the stuff who pay for it. And so there's a Kickstarter project that looks very cool. It's somebody wants to raise money to create a cable, a cord, for your iPhone that has like a glowing light in it, so it's easy to dock at night. And basically, you can pledge $25 and then get this cord, and it looks kind of cool. So basically, CordLight, it says, is a charging cable that provides illumination, enabling you to see your charging port in any low light environment. It's so simple that by simply picking it up or holding it, it illuminates. It says the touch design eliminates the need for buttons or switches and keeps the look clean and simple. And it's made of rigid plastic and beaded blasted aluminum for the touch plates. So this looks kind of cool. There's a little video, I guess it's okay to play, that shows how it works. And it shows, like, people always have trouble connecting their device to the USB cable that works with the iPhone. I have that same problem when I'm using it. And basically the CordLight, when you touch it, it just creates like a light. So this is very clever. Now they need to raise $70,000 and they've only raised $9,840. So I think it's a cool project to have like a light built into the cord. And I don't know, maybe I'll donate $25. It's not that much money if it can really do this. So this is what I like about Kickstarter. There's a lot of stuff for the iPhone and the iPad, and people are very innovative. Now, one of the reasons that I jailbreak my iPhone or iPad is so that I could use FaceTime, which is the video conferencing service that Apple has for free on the iPhone and the iPad, over 3G, because Apple makes it so that you can only use FaceTime over Wi-Fi. And so one of the reasons I jailbreak the iPhone is to get this app that allows you to trick the iPhone into thinking that you're over Wi-Fi when you're over 3G. So apparently, according to Gizmodo.com, citing a Romanian blog called iDevice, it looks like Apple may be turning on FaceTime over 3G. And this is based on an error that pops up that's in iOS 5.1.1. And basically, an error pops up that says disabling 3G will end FaceTime. Are you sure you want to disable 3G? Now, why would you? Well, that they seem to think that's a clue that that this is going to happen soon. And so the article says, but while Apple may be testing it, the question is if carriers would allow it and how, or if this even makes sense in the United States, given the impending death of unlimited data plans. I mean, I think it would make sense to have FaceTime over 3G, because there are going to be instances where you want to have 3G FaceTime. I mean, I've been on some business trips where I didn't have Wi-Fi connection, and I just wanted to briefly talk to my family and have them see me over FaceTime, and having this jailbreak app that allowed that to happen over 3G was a big plus. So I'm all for it, and frankly, if users get the ability to use this stuff over 3G and it uses a lot of data, it will put pressure on the carriers to increase the data rates, because at some point users are going to rebel, or Congress is going to rebel, if carriers charge a lot more money for tiered data plans. So one thing that people are really anticipating is the next iPhone. I guess it's going to be called the iPhone 5. That will probably come out around the same time that the iPhone 4S came out last year. iPhone 4S was announced on October 4th, actually the day before Steve Jobs died on October 5th. And I think it was like available a week later. Prior to that, the iPhones had always come out really and announced around WWDC, which this year starts June 11th. So, but there's been a lot of speculation as to what the next iPhone would look like, and all the rumors point to, and rumors can be absolutely wrong, but the rumors point to the next iPhone having a 4-inch diagonal screen instead of 3.5 inches. So it won't be a massively larger screen. And MacRumors reports that Bloomberg reports that Steve Jobs was intimately involved in the design work for the next generation iPhone, scheduled for release later this year. It says here in a quote, Apple, based in Cupertino, has placed orders from suppliers in Asia for screens that are bigger than the 3.5-inch size now on the smartphone, said one of the people who asked not to be identified because the plans aren't public. It goes on to say Apple co-founder Steve Jobs had worked closely on the redesigned phone from his death in October, one person said. The quote goes on to say Apple has been working on the new device since before the current iPhone 4S model was introduced last October, said one person with knowledge of the project. Well, obviously Apple has these iPhones in development, well ahead of time, right? The iPhone 4S came out in October, so you have to imagine even months before the iPhone 4S comes out, they're working on the next iPhone and planning it and designing it. And I'm sure Steve Jobs had a big say in that, So the question is, will there be a drastic change? Well, historically, Apple's somewhat conservative, and it's not going to, Apple's highly successful with the iPhone, so it's not going to do radical changes. On the other hand, maybe after two forms, it does change the form factor. Remember, the original iPhone came out, and then there was the 3G, and then the 3GS looked identical to the 3G, except it had a better processor and a better camera. And then the iPhone 4 came out, and it was a completely different design. It's actually quite a beautiful design than compared to the more rounded iPhone 3G and 3GS. But then Apple kept the body the same for another year in the iPhone 4S. And I think Apple likes having the same shape and body for 2 years, and essentially just upgrade in the second year the components, because it makes it easier for to scale manufacturing when you're going to be selling a product for 2 years and building it. And also it's better for the ecosystem. Look at when the iPhone 4S came out, it was much easier to get cases for it than when the first iPhone 4 came out. So what do I think the next iPhone will look like? I think it will probably have a slightly bigger screen. I think it's going to definitely have a faster processor, and it may have LTE like the iPad. The real challenge for Apple is the battery, right? Because once you start putting in this 4G cell phone chip, LTE, that's a battery hog. And that's one of the reasons the iPad became a little thicker and a little heavier. So if Apple does put LTE in the iPhone, I wouldn't be surprised if the iPhone becomes a little bigger and a little heavier, because they're jamming as much battery in it as possible. And I wouldn't also be surprised if Apple came out with its own unique way to augment the battery in the iPhone. There's a whole ecosystem of third-party accessories that you can attach an extra battery, like as part of a case, to the iPhone. And let's say Apple does come out with an LTE version of the iPhone, and it's a battery hog. Maybe Apple will sell a case for $100 that has an extra battery life in it and has some clever way of making it integrated with the iPhone. So I think that's possible. And so I think the big thing is going to be that it has LTE in it, and that it has a faster processor in it. And maybe, if the camera can be improved anymore, maybe a better camera. So I'm not surprised that Steve Jobs would have been involved in design, and I think it's going to be quite exciting to see what Apple comes out with. Well, one thing that is due to get upgraded much sooner than the iPhone is our beloved Macintosh. And MacRumors has a story out on May 14th, 2012, saying that the Retina Displays are coming in the next generation iMacs. And that was also a part of a roundup of rumors that ABC News had regarding the latest MacBook Pros that said that the MacBook Pros would also get Retina displays. Now, Retina displays are just super high pixel resolution. So, for example, the third generation iPad has a very high pixel resolution. So basically, the rumor mill says that the next upgrades to the iMacs and the MacBook Pros are going to see really high pixel resolution. So MacRumors claims that this is going to happen to also the iMacs, which would be pretty remarkable because they already have a lot of high pixels. It says here the 21.5-inch iMac would see a pixel count in the range of the 17-inch MacBook Pro, as its 1920 by 1080 resolution would be bumped to 3840 times 2160. But then it goes on to say, but the 27-inch iMac would move from its current resolution, if you doubled it, of 2560 times 1440 to a monster Retina display of 5120 times 2880. The same panel could be used in a revised Apple Thunderbolt display should hardware be able to support the resolution. So the thing is, when you start talking about that kind of resolution, it's pretty massive. So MacRumors is saying, consequently, some have suggested that Apple would increase display resolution on its Mac lines by a smaller amount than on the iOS devices. And, it points out that most Mac models offer pixel densities in the range of 100 to 130 pixels. So I don't know, if it makes sense for Apple to double the pixel resolution of, let's say, the 27-inch iMac. Going to system preferences, let's bring this into the screen here. My display has a resolution of 2560 times 1440 on the 27-inch iMac. That's pretty large, you know. So are we going to have like a 5000, 5000 by 2880? That seems incredibly dense and would take up a lot of video processor power. I mean, one thing is maybe Apple has found a way to scale the pixels, easily. One problem is when you go to this incredibly high pixel resolution, images and websites that haven't scaled up don't look as nice on the web. That's a problem with the iPad. It's also a problem with apps that haven't scaled up. So I don't know. That'd be very interesting. So what do I think the next Macs will look like? And they're definitely due for an upgrade. Well, here's the thing. I think the MacBook Pro is definitely going to be thinner and lighter and get rid of the DVD drive. I think DVD drives, their time has gone. I don't think we need them anymore. There really should just be an external attachment like for the MacBook Air. I hardly ever use a CD or DVD drive. So Apple can save a lot of space and size in a MacBook Pro by getting rid of it. And they should make it so that the MacBook Pros come standard with an SSD drive installed, because the SSD drives make Macs run much faster and much more smoothly than when you use a traditional hard drive. And right now, I think you can, let's see, with the current MacBook Pro, you can configure, let's select the 1500-inch one. It comes standard with a 500 gigabyte serial drive, but you can opt to instead have a 128 gigabyte solid state drive or up to a 512 SSD drive. But I think Apple should just say we're going to make it standard to have a 128 gigabyte drive and give people the option of putting a second hard drive in the MacBook Pro. If you get rid of the DVD drive, you can put a second drive in the MacBook Pro. Similarly, for the iMacs, Apple can currently configure it with 2 drives. Right now, if you want an SSD drive, it'll be second to a hard drive. But wouldn't it be really cool if it just came standard with here, let's pick the 21-inch one. So right now, you can configure it with a 256 solid state drive, but that's a $500 extra. Frankly, the prices are too high for the SSD drive. You can get a much better deal at Otherworld Computing. So I think you're going to see a major speed bump in the Macs and the iMacs, and I think you're going to see the MacBook Pros slim down and be something closer to the size of the MacBook Airs. The MacBook Airs are clearly the top-selling Macs in the Apple's Mac line, and Apple is definitely going to probably soup up the MacBook Air line. One thing that Apple can do to improve the MacBook Air line is use SSD drives that are 3G, 6G, I'm sorry. And right now, Apple's using inferior SSD drives. Otherworld Computing sells SSD drives that have double the read-write speeds of the SSD drives that Apple currently puts in the MacBook Air. What's interesting is that the current MacBook Air can take a faster SSD drive because it has an eSATA connection that can handle the faster speed, but Apple doesn't include it in it. So Apple could just easily put in the faster SSD drive that would make it even more responsive. So anyways, this could be as early as next week, these sort of updates. Or these updates could be at WWDC on June 11th. Either way, they're coming very soon. Okay, so that's it for episode 115 of the Apple Podcast. Thanks for listening. This is Lex at Mac's Future, and you can help out this podcast by giving it a positive review in the iTunes store, or go to Mac's Future on YouTube or Blip TV and check out the video version of this and give it any sort of positive feedback that you feel you can give. So thanks for listening, and see you next week.